January 17th, 1940. North Sea, 0347 hours. The radio operator's hand trembled against the cold metal of his transmitter key. Outside the communications bunker on the Danish coast, winter wind cut through the darkness like a blade through silk. Inside, Lieutenant Klaus Brenner sat hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to static that felt alive, crackling, breathing, waiting. The tea in his tin cup had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't noticed. His entire world had contracted to the rhythm of dots and dashes, the Morse code heartbeat of U-47 somewhere beneath the Blackwater, 300 kilometers northwest. The submarine had been maintaining regular contact every 4 hours since departing Wilhelmshaven. Brenner had logged each transmission with Germanic precision. Position updates, fuel status, atmospheric pressure readings. Routine, predictable, safe. But at 0347, in the space between one breath and the next, the signal simply stopped. Not the gradual fade of a vessel moving beyond range. Not the distorted warble of equipment failure. Just silence. Complete. Absolute. As if the ocean itself had swallowed sound. Brenner's fingers moved automatically across the key, tapping out the recall signal. Once. Twice. 3 times. The response should have been immediate. U-boat commanders were trained to maintain contact like monks maintain prayer, disciplined, unbroken, sacred. But the static offered nothing. He checked his connections, verified his frequencies, consulted his logs. Everything functioned perfectly. Everything except the one thing that mattered. 8 seconds passed. In the grand machinery of war, 8 seconds meant nothing. Soldiers spent hours in trenches waiting for orders that never came. Pilots circled empty skies for minutes before engaging. 8 seconds was barely enough time to light a cigarette, to whisper a prayer, to remember the face of someone left behind. But in those 8 seconds, Klaus Brenner felt the floor of certainty drop away beneath him. He had been a radio operator for 3 years. He knew what silence meant. Silence meant depth charges. Silence meant hull breaches. Silence meant 47 men entombed in steel, sinking into darkness they would never escape. Then the headphones crackled. But what came through was not Morse code. When the Kriegsmarine commissioned its U-boat fleet in the years before the war, they built more than submarines. They built mythology. As these vessels represented the apex of German engineering, silent hunters designed to strangle Britain's supply lines, to turn the Atlantic into a graveyard, to prove that technology and will could overcome any numerical disadvantage. The men who served aboard them were volunteers, an elite corps who understood that every dive might be their last. They descended into the deep with confidence born from training, from doctrine, from the certainty that their machines were superior and their cause inevitable. U-47 was among the finest. Her captain, Kapitän Leutnant Günther Prien, had become a national hero 5 months earlier when he penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak. Goebbels' propaganda machine had transformed him into a symbol of Aryan invincibility, the Bull of Scapa Flow, fearless and unstoppable. When U-47 departed on her January patrol, her crew carried that mythology with them, wrapped around their shoulders like armor against the cold Atlantic waters. They expected to hunt. They expected to kill. They expected, perhaps, to die with honor in service to the Reich. What they did not expect, what no amount of training or indoctrination could have prepared them for, was to encounter something that would unravel the very foundation of everything they believed about their enemy. The voice that emerged from Klaus Brenner's headphones was not speaking German. It was English. American English, to be precise. The drawling, casual cadence of someone from the American Midwest, was speaking with the unhurried confidence of a man discussing the weather rather than matters of life and death. The transmission was weak, fragmented by distance and atmospheric interference, but unmistakable. Brenner's training told him to log it immediately, to alert his commanding officer, to follow protocol, but his hand remained frozen above his logbook, pen hovering, unable to write what his ears were hearing. Negative on that last position switchboard. U-boat contact lost at grid reference Charlie 7. The transmission dissolved into static, then reformed. Experimental detection gear working better than expected. Roosevelt's gadget boys really outdid themselves this time. We tagged him at 20 kilometers. 20 kilometers. Before the war, we'd be lucky to spot a periscope at 2. More static. Brenner adjusted his frequency dial with surgeon's precision, chasing the signal. Reading atmospheric pressure drop. He's diving deep, real deep, but we've got him painted like a barn door. Surface vessels moving to intercept. Should have splashes on target in 90 seconds. The transmission cut off. Brenner sat paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the implications. The Americans weren't supposed to be here. The United States hadn't entered the war. The North Sea was a European battlefield, a private dance between Germany and Britain, with strict rules written in blood and doctrine. But more disturbing than the American presence was what they were describing. Detection equipment that could track submerged submarines at distances that should have been impossible. A range-finding technology that turned the ocean's protective darkness into glass. U-47 wasn't hunting. She was being hunted. And she didn't know it. Brenner's fingers finally moved, transcribing frantically even as his hands shook. But before he could complete his log entry, his headphones crackled again. This time, the signal was different, weaker, more desperate. German Morse code, fragmentary and irregular. U-47's emergency frequency. Under attack, stop unknown origin. Stop multiple detonations. Stop taking water. Stop cannot identify. Then nothing. Brenner tore off his headphones and ran for the command bunker, his breath forming white clouds in the January darkness, his mind already composing the report that could not be believed. And the strategic calculus of submarine warfare rested on a simple principle. Invisibility equals survival. A submerged U-boat was theoretically undetectable, a ghost moving through an environment too vast and too dark for human senses to penetrate. British destroyers could listen for engine noise, watch for periscope wakes, drop depth charges in patterns based on educated guesses. But these were defensive measures, reactive and imprecise. The hunter was always one step behind the hunted. Or so German naval doctrine insisted. What Klaus Brenner had intercepted, what his superiors would spend the next 3 days attempting to verify, dismiss, and finally, reluctantly, accept, was evidence that the equation had been inverted. Somewhere in the secret laboratories of Allied nations, user scientists and engineers had created what would later be called sonar, sound, navigation, and ranging. The technology was primitive by later standards, plagued by false echoes and ambient noise, limited by thermal layers and salinity gradients. But it worked. It turned the ocean into a mapped space, transforming submarines from invisible predators into tracked targets. The implications were theological as much as tactical. If German U-boats could be detected, tracked, and destroyed while submerged, then the entire strategic premise of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic campaign collapsed. The mythology of the unstoppable submarine, the narrative that sustained morale, justified losses, promised eventual victory, became fairy tale. And if the Americans possessed this technology while still officially neutral, and if they were sharing it with the British, testing it in active war zones, coordinating attacks against German vessels, then what other secrets were being kept? What other assumptions were about to shatter? U-47 never returned to port. Official records listed her as missing, presumed lost, after failing to report at her scheduled rendezvous point on January 23, 1940. The Kriegsmarine filed standard casualty reports. Families received notifications written in bureaucratic language designed to transform grief into patriotic acceptance. Günther Prien was commemorated with posthumous honors, his legend preserved in propaganda that carefully omitted the circumstances of his death. The crew of 47 men simply vanished into the statistical ledger of war, 47 names among millions. But Klaus Brenner's report survived, and it circulated through naval intelligence with the classification markings of something too dangerous to acknowledge, too important to destroy. Analysts studied the intercepted transmissions, comparing them with British naval movements, cross-referencing with weather reports and acoustic conditions. Slowly, reluctantly, a picture emerged. The Americans were not merely supplying Britain with equipment. They were actively participating in the war's invisible dimensions, testing experimental technology, training Allied operators, providing real-time intelligence. The neutrality claimed by the Roosevelt administration was a legal fiction, a diplomatic facade behind which American engineers and strategists were already waging war against the Reich. Other reports began surfacing, and submarine crews described inexplicable attacks, depth charges that found them in deep water, destroyers that altered course to intercept before periscopes surfaced, patterns that suggested prediction rather than reaction. The crews called it bad luck, or attributed it to British skill, because the alternative was too disturbing to confront. But the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The ocean was no longer safe, the depths no longer protected. The fundamental assumption of submarine warfare, that a submerged vessel was effectively invisible, had been rendered obsolete by physics and electronics. The symbolic death of the U-boat was also the death of a certain kind of confidence. German naval officers had entered the war believing that superior technology and doctrine would compensate for numerical inferiority, and they had studied the lessons of World War I, developed counter-strategies, trained elite crews in tactics designed to exploit British weaknesses. But they had not anticipated that their enemy might simply change the rules, that the ocean itself might be transformed from an ally into a transparent medium where everything could be seen, measured, tracked. In the communications bunker on the Danish coast, a tin cup of cold tea sat forgotten beside a radio transmitter that would never again receive signals from U-47. Klaus Brenner had gone on to other assignments, other frequencies, other ghosts speaking through static. But he kept a small item in his footlocker throughout the war, a fragment of paper torn from his logbook, dated January 17, 1940, 03:47 hours. On it, transcribed in his careful handwriting, cut were the words that had emerged from 8 seconds of silence. "We've got him painted like a barn door." The phrase haunted him, not because of its content, but because of its tone. The American voice had sounded casual, almost bored, discussing the destruction of 47 men with the same inflection someone might use to comment on a successful fishing trip. There was no hatred in it, no passion, no ideological fervor, just competent professionalism. The matter-of-fact efficiency of someone doing a job, using tools that worked, achieving results that could be measured and reported. This, Brenner eventually understood, was more frightening than any display of military might. The Allies weren't matching German fanaticism with their own fanaticism. They weren't responding to ideology with counter-ideology. And they were simply engineering solutions to problems, testing hypotheses, refining equipment, and deploying it with industrial efficiency. Where German doctrine demanded sacrifice and will, American pragmatism asked only what worked. Where Nazi mythology promised supernatural destiny, Allied laboratories offered calibrated instruments that turned belief into measurable data. The war would continue for 5 more years after U-47's disappearance. Sonar technology would be refined, deployed across hundreds of vessels, and supplemented with radar, code breaking, and aerial reconnaissance. The Battle of the Atlantic would be won not through superior courage or ideological purity, but through accumulated advantages in technology, production capacity, and systematic application of scientific method. German U-boats would continue to sink Allied shipping, but at a casualty rate that made each success more costly than sustainable. By 1943, the underwater arm of the Kriegsmarine had been reduced from hunter to hunted, spending more time fleeing than attacking, diving deeper and deeper into ocean darkness that no longer concealed them. The symbolic resonance of that January night extended beyond tactical considerations. 8 seconds of silence followed by an American voice represented something deeper than technological surprise. It revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. Germany had entered the war believing that will could triumph over material disadvantage, that superior spirit and doctrine could defeat numerically superior, but presumably decadent democracies. And the intercepted transmission suggested a different reality. The democratic societies, with their emphasis on pragmatic problem-solving and scientific inquiry, were adapting to war faster and more effectively than totalitarian systems constrained by ideology and dogma. Klaus Brenner survived the war. He was captured in 1945, spent 2 years in a British POW camp, and eventually returned to a divided Germany, where the certainties of 1940 had dissolved into rubble and disillusionment. In his later years, he rarely discussed his wartime service. But when he did, he always returned to that January night, to 8 seconds that felt like hours, to the moment when silence broke and revealed that everything he had been taught about German superiority was illusion. He kept the fragment of paper until he died in 1983. His daughter found it among his effects, a cryptic sentence written in faded ink that meant nothing to her. She threw it away while cleaning out his apartment, never knowing it had once represented the exact moment when mythology met measurement, when faith encountered physics, when a voice emerged from static to pronounce judgment on an empire that believed itself invincible. "We've got him painted like a barn door." In 8 words, a paradigm collapsed, not with theatrical drama or cinematic explosion, but with the casual competence of someone describing work successfully completed. The ocean had been mapped, the invisible had been made visible. The future had announced itself through crackling radio static, and it spoke with an American accent, discussing death and detection with the same tone used to report the weather. No U-47 rests somewhere on the floor of the North Sea. Her exact location still unknown, her crew still entombed in steel. But her death marked something larger than one submarine's loss. It marked the end of certainty, the collapse of doctrine, the moment when technology transformed war from a contest of wills into a problem solved by engineering. The men who died never knew they were being tracked. They descended into darkness, believing it would protect them. They were wrong. And in that wrongness, in the gap between expectation and reality, in 8 seconds of silence followed by impossible words, the entire trajectory of the war was written. Not in grand strategy or ideological triumph, but in the quiet voice of a technician reporting that his equipment, Roosevelt's experimental gadget, worked exactly as designed, that he could see what should have been invisible, that the barn door, painted bright and clear on his detection screen, was sinking toward the bottom, taking with it not just 47 lives, but the last vestiges of a mythology that had promised certainty in an uncertain world. The radio went dead for 8 seconds. Then command heard the impossible, and nothing was ever the same.